Have you ever been really close to losing it, but you're not really sure why? The window of tolerance can help explain some of the reasons why from day to day we might struggle more or less with our emotional state. I'm an occupational therapist and I teach mental health skills in group therapy. Within the window of tolerance, we can cope with day-to-day stresses reasonably well. We've got enough resource within ourselves to be able to handle everyday pressures without becoming overloaded and overwhelmed. And in that state, we're able to concentrate on tasks, we're able to focus our attention, and we're able to complete things and fulfill our day-to-day demands without being overloaded. We can either move into a state called hyperarousal, which would be overwhelmed, overloaded, stressed, anxious, not able to sleep, feeling quite wired. And then the opposite of that is hypoarousal. And in that state, we might be very fatigued, need to sleep excessively, wanting to stay in bed, not able to attend to either day-to-day duties, or we're not able to fulfill general responsibilities that we might normally be able to cope with. So in this particular model, the two extremes of hypo and hyperarousal would be when the nervous system is no longer coping. It's tied to the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the fight, flight, freeze response. Now this system runs throughout our whole body and includes our brain, kidneys with the adrenal glands, and a lot of complex chemical messaging that helps our body respond to the stresses with the appropriate hormones, and particularly cortisol and adrenaline. As part of this response, our body's natural tendency is to release more cortisol and adrenaline to cope with the demands that are required in a given situation in our daily lives. Now, depending on how this process goes, one might end up being in a chronic state of stress. There are a few factors that determine how wide our window of tolerance might be. So these would include, there are at least three main factors broadly that affect our window of tolerance. These would be trauma, chronic stress, allostatic load, which is basically situational stress and pressure. So trauma has a big impact on the fight or flight system because it changes a number of things in relation to how the body responds to that stress. So in some ways, the body is more tuned or sensitive to stresses. And this happens for a number of reasons, some of which are a bit beyond the scope of this particular video. But often in my experience, people that have had trauma or adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short, and those could be quite a wide variety of experiences in childhood, tend to have a more narrow window of tolerance. Chronic stress has a big impact on how wide our window of tolerance is. With more chronic stress, it's more difficult to cope with stress. We might resort to using more unhelpful coping behaviours, and this then compounds that problem. The brain becomes more susceptible to stress in general, and at this stage there might be a tendency to move between a state of hyperarousal and hypoarousal. On any given day, this can look quite different. A siren is a good example of a stressor. On any given day, our level of tolerance around stresses changes. Under chronic load during the day, the body might be in a hyperaroused state, particularly to cope with the demands. The adrenaline and cortisol help us get on with what we've got to do, and often we might be able to concentrate, and hence the saying, we're literally running on adrenaline. And then perhaps in the evening, there might be a tendency to crash, stay on the couch, not move, not do anything in particular, and possibly watch TV, go to bed, not have a very good night's sleep, and then start again the next day. So that kind of chronic stress generally narrows people's window of tolerance. In relative terms, if you are at your level 8 out of 10, then your window of tolerance is much more narrow. So it makes it much more difficult to cope with whatever the demand of the situation is, because it's much more difficult to think clearly. It's much more difficult to plan ahead in terms of what you need to do next. And then things start getting much more shaky. This is not dissimilar to the idea of the stress performance curve, which suggests that under too much stress, performance goes down. So there's a healthy level of stress up until that point, or in other words, the arousal level is helpful to meet a goal or task demand, but then it tips over the edge and becomes counterproductive and destructive. So those are the main three things that would affect our window of tolerance on any given day. Some of the fastest ways of getting back your window of tolerance would be to pause in situations where you feel stressed and just gather your thoughts. Take a breath in, allow yourself that time to just interrupt that stress response, which can be overwhelming and take over in the situation. By getting your thinking brain back online, you're able to plan, solve problems, and then that helps to reduce the stress because you feel like you're back in control. The second one would be to take micro breaks much more regularly. And these don't need to be complicated. And in fact, the more simple these are, the more effectively they might work. And that would help to pace your breathing and just calm down. And then alternatives might be even lying on the ground. Now, if you're at work or something, that might not be an ideal scenario. It might be even sitting on the floor. So with the breath, allowing yourself permission to just stop and actually pause for a few minutes. Take that breath in. Exhale slowly, give yourself permission to actually relax. And it's important to mentally connect with what you're trying to relax. I find often giving yourself the permission to actually do it, allowing yourself to say, I'm going to let this work. I'm going to let my body calm down, take that break, settle. Park the stress for a moment. It's not going away, especially if it's something that you actually have to attend to. And just bring that down momentarily before you allow yourself to ease from that state. And then you might say to yourself, right, now what do I need to attend to as a matter of urgency? Is it as important as it was before? And now that that moment has passed, where the stress has eased slightly, you might find that you can attend to the problem that you were trying to solve with more intention and more of a balanced state of mind. So that's a summary of the window of tolerance and some very basic general strategies to interrupt the cycle of moving into a hyper-aroused state and then crashing. These skills are not easy and they take some attention over time, but the concept is a good one to work with to understand on any given day what might be leading you into a more stressed state where you feel like you can't cope. The more of a handle we can get on something like your background window, the more you're able to use effective behavioural strategies to stay more regulated in general, and then that helps to manage emotion more effectively and be able to de-escalate a more stressed and heightened response. So as with many of these concepts, it's important to take the ones that are useful and adopt what's helpful from them. None of the models explain everything. And as usual, if you're struggling or you need to reach out for help, please do so. And be sure to follow further video content as I'm able to put more videos out there into the world and help people to practice mental health skills, which are some of the most important life skills that one might develop. Thanks for staying with me and best wishes.